This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press, and this is a great collection of books about animal studies. Given the topic of our conversation today, I'll mention in particular the 2020 book Meatsplaining, The Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial, edited by Jason Hannon. You can learn more about that book and all the other books in the series on the Sydney University Press website. And also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today I'm very pleased to introduce you to someone I met at the Animal Advocacy Conference at the University of Kent in June 2023. Devon Docherty is a recent graduate of the Master's Programme in Human-Animal Interactions at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and she's a tutor in Stirling's Division of Psychology. She's also a media assistant with the British animal activist organisation SURGE. Today we're going to talk about her paper The Cheese Paradox: How do vegetarians justify consuming non-meat animal products? This was co-authored with Dr Carol Jasper and published open access, meaning it's free to read online from anywhere in the world, in the journal Appetite. Welcome to the podcast, Devon.
Thank you very much.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, so this paper was probably inspired by my own journey to veganism. I've always felt really strongly about animals and animal welfare, and since about the age of 10, I've been traversing various diets from dropping meat to being a pescatarian and I was vegetarian for quite some time. And it was upon reflection of my own time as a vegetarian that I realised there was an interesting conflict going on where I was really attached to my identity as an animal defender, if you like. And yet, on some level, I knew that dairy and eggs, which I relied upon heavily in my diet, involved exploitation. And in particular, one memory is really vivid where one night after a night out, I was ordering a pizza with my friends, as we often did. And I was criticising my friend for getting pepperoni on their pizza. And I remember they turned round to me and they said, "Well, you eat cheese, so you're no better." And that was the first time that someone had sort of implied that I wasn't doing everything that I could to protect animals. And it was pretty jarring because I feel like it brought to the surface this thing that I knew but wasn't allowing myself to fully acknowledge. So yeah, when my philosophy and my commitment to animal rights developed, I just got really interested in this sort of grey area that I had been traversing as a vegetarian. And I wondered if this conflict would be prevalent in other vegetarians and what we could learn from it. And then on top of that, I realised that all the literature on vegetarian attitudes and motivations was focused on their decision to cut meat from their diet, and there was nothing on their decision to include dairy and eggs. So there was definitely a gap in the literature as well.
I think for us to understand this study, we need to start by making sure we're clear on the meat paradox, which is something that has existed in psychology for a little while and you're very much building upon. So could you introduce us to the meat paradox?
Yes, so the meat paradox came from a 2010 paper by Steve Loughnane and colleagues, and it refers to the idea that people don't want to hurt animals, and yet they also want to eat the flesh of animals. This is a conflict that causes mental discomfort, and this is what we call dissonance discomfort, and dissonance is the way of saying it. And this dissonance, it must be resolved. So we are prompted to either change our values or change our behavior or almost obscure the contradiction between the behavior and the value. So, yeah, the meat paradox is relying heavily on a theory called cognitive dissonance. That just means that when we have two conflicting ideas or beliefs, our mind really wants to restore harmony and make those beliefs become back in line with each other again.
So, in order to study vegetarianism, you've conducted a series of interviews. Could you tell us a bit about that process?
I chose interviews because I think they can produce a lot more in-depth data, and we generated about 65,000 words from just 12 interviews. So I think for studies that don't have a lot of information out there, like this was an exploratory study, we were just seeking to see if there could be a conflict. So really, we didn't need a huge sample size. We chose to go for a smaller sample size and more in-depth interviews to really get into the nitty-gritty about how people feel and allowing them to like fully express their thoughts and take us through those conflicts. So interviews were a really nice medium for allowing people to express themselves freely with no time constraints and no constraints of like a survey or a questionnaire where the question might be worded funnily. So yeah, I found it was a really good medium for just exploring this topic.
So, the first theme that emerged from these interviews with vegetarians is what you call acknowledging harm. So, it seems that actually this was very common among the vegetarians you spoke to.
It was, yeah, it was quite surprising at first that so many of the vegetarians we interviewed that they did acknowledge that these products that they eat, cheese, milk, and eggs, that they were a source of harm to animals. And I definitely wouldn't extend this to the whole vegetarian population because our sample were from like mostly a university background, and this might mean that they could be more familiar with veganism. They could be in circles where these issues are talked about a lot more. So maybe they had an enhanced understanding of the ethical issues around dairy and eggs. But in general, I would say they had quite a broad grasp on the main issues surrounding dairy and eggs, whether that be genetic modification, the confinement of animals, unsanitary living conditions, and they even acknowledged the killing of male offspring in these industries. And also, some people acknowledged that these animals actually do eventually go to slaughter. So, yeah, that was interesting and also really surprising because it does seem like it would contradict the ethical aspect of being a vegetarian, and that would be not killing animals for food. So, yeah, that was one of our most interesting findings for sure.
In the psychology of meat eating, the idea of the four N's, that is, the normalness of meat, the necessity of meat, the naturalness of meat, and the niceness of meat, has been kind of ubiquitous in thinking about the justification of meat consumption. Is it fair to say that vegetarians are consuming eggs and milk for the same kinds of reasons?
Niceness, especially, was very salient. I think we all know that a lot of people they're not eating cheese because they think it's going to be amazing for their health. A lot of people eat cheese because it simply tastes really good. So nice was very prevalent. Then we have normal, which is that everyone around us in our social circles tends to be eating these products. They're also in a lot of other products as byproducts. So yeah, we're seeing them all the time. They're normal. And then we have necessity, which was definitely more related to eggs, I would say, in our sample, because eggs were very related to health. So it was like, I need eggs for protein, I need eggs for calcium. Some people did relate this necessity to dairy as well, but more heavily with eggs. So definitely those three ends were very, very prevalent. Now, natural was completely absent as a justification, which was really interesting. And we posited that this is probably the case because while meat eaters use this argument that it's natural to eat the flesh of another species, it happens all the time in nature. Human beings have done it for thousands of years. But you can't quite say the same for dairy and eggs. Egg eating is a little bit more common in nature, but certainly not dairy. I believe we're one of the only species that has been recorded drinking the milk of another species, and certainly the only species that has been demonstrated to take that milk from another species and then, coagulate it and add different stuff in to make it into cheese. That definitely couldn't be described as natural, and the participants definitely didn't use natural as justification for eating non-meat animal products.
Now, this is really interesting because we're seeing very different justifications for meat, for milk, and for eggs emerging when we think about this 4N framework. But as the title of your paper suggests, actually you're finding that there's different justifications for different dairy products as well.
Yes, so we discovered a discrepancy whereby many of the participants, they didn't drink liquid milk, but they did eat cheese. And actually they felt a lot more guilty, a lot more ethical conflict about the idea or the thought of consuming liquid milk than eating cheese. And this was really interesting to us. And of course, it's a bit paradoxical because they come from the exact same source. And not only that, but actually, it's around 10 litres of liquid milk are needed to produce just 1 kilogram of cheese. So actually, eating cheese might have more of a negative impact upon dairy cows or dairy goats or whatever animal it is that's producing the milk. The way that participants tried to explain this discrepancy is that it was something about the shape of cheese that just their mind could not associate it with the same brutality as the mind could associate with milk. And we think it's because the process of processing, whereby as milk is turned into cheese, it is completely transformed in taste, color, texture, smell. And so a lot more leaps in reasoning are made to associate a block with the same brutality as you can associate milk, which it's been pasteurized, but it looks almost exactly the same as when it came from the animal.
It feels like there's lots of room for further work on the psychology of eating non-meat animal products. What kind of further work would you like to see?
Well, I would definitely like to see a quantitative measure of the cheese paradox so that we can really strengthen this finding. There was a paper that Loughnane and colleagues also did where they gave participants either nuts or beef, and then they tested their moral concern for animals. And basically, they found that the people who had just eaten the beef rated cows as less likely to capable of experiencing suffering, and they just were concerned for less animals. Whereas the people who ate nuts, who weren't eating meat, they had a higher moral concern. They included more animals in their circle of moral concern. So I think it would be really interesting to do this with cheese and see if eating cheese immediately led to a reduction in moral concern for the animal from whom the cheeses came from, probably a dairy cow. Because we've explored it in a qualitative avenue, having a quantitative measure would really help. And also, one of our suggestions for potential reduction strategies was that cheese should be more strongly linked to liquid milk and to the living animal so that it challenges the cognitive dissonance that we go through, and it triggers empathy for dairy cows as well. So researchers could expose people to these messages and then see if that does have an impact or not on people's willingness to consume cheese.
Oh, that's fascinating. I was also wondering about other non-meat products. So you mentioned briefly insect-based products in the paper, and I think there was also a mention of gelatin. Did these come up in your conversations with vegetarians?
Gelatin definitely did, because quite a few participants said that they would eat gelatin if it's within other products. Like someone really liked Haribo, and gelatin are in Haribo, so they said, look, if something is an extra ingredient in a product, I'm still going to eat it, which is particularly interesting with gelatin because, of course, gelatin could actually be considered a meat product because it's derived from body parts like bones and tendons that are boiled together. In terms of other non-meat stuff, I think in the paper you mentioned honey and shellac, and these, I think there's going to have to be a lot of work done with these products to make the public realize that they actually are really harmful to animals. And dairy and eggs, I think we're definitely moving towards a bigger understanding of the ethical implications of these products. But things like honey that's made by bees from plants, they actually regurgitate it and then it solidifies in the hive. And shellac, which I think is secreted by the female lac bug. We should definitely do some studies. I'm not sure of how they could be designed yet. I would have to have a think about that. But there's definitely room for exploring these products and how we can get people to think about the ethical impact of them.
Now, one of the reasons I was really excited about this study, and this reflects one of my own research interests or something I've written about a bit, is that it looks at vegetarianism specifically, independent of veganism. Now, I've heard some people say that veganism has effectively replaced vegetarianism. So I'd be interested to hear your view on this. Do you think vegetarianism is here to stay?
I think vegetarianism can be a really useful step in animal product production, but ultimately I do think that veganism should always be the end goal, just because, well, for one, in terms of the data, I'm sure that there might be some more up-to-date statistics on this, but last I read was I think it was a 2016 or 2018 paper that showed that vegetarians get more of their daily calories from products like cheese and yogurt and eggs than any other dietary group. So that's from meat eaters, pescatarians, etc., etc. And the paper also found that vegetarians eat double the amount of cheese than meat eaters. So what this means is that, and my participants also sort of confirmed this, that when they gave up meat, they actually just replaced the meat with cheese, and they were eating a lot more cheese than they had when they were meat eaters. And that's obviously quite problematic because in terms of animal harm, well, animals in the dairy industry and the egg industry, they suffer a lot, and often they just suffer longer than animals in the meat industry would. So it's actually possible that these products are actually having, in some cases, a worse impact upon animals than meat products because they're exploited for a longer period of time before going to the slaughterhouse. So I definitely think vegetarianism should never be touted as the ideal or the final destination.
This question's a little bit by the by in some ways, but I was really interested to see that you included a reflexivity statement about the fact that both you and Carol are ethical vegans. So, is the worry that your own status as a vegan might undermine the validity of this study?
That was definitely a concern of mine because all throughout my university career, at least, I have been challenged a lot for my animal rights perspective and told by a lot of tutors and lecturers that my perspective was biased, which was a little frustrating because whenever I would write about another social justice issue, whether it was feminism and queer theory and these things, I was never called biased. And so I just didn't think it was very fair, and it kind of put me off writing about animals in academia. And then I discovered reflexive thematic analysis. And that's just a method that we can use to analyze qualitative data. But reflexive thematic analysis, it involves highlighting and acknowledging the researcher's active role in knowledge production. So I personally don't believe in total objectivity. I don't think it's achievable. I think all human beings, regardless of their their career and their different positions, and regardless of how objective they want to be, I think all human beings do have some bias. And I think that has to be acknowledged, otherwise we're not being totally truthful. So to fit in with the reflexive thematic analysis method, we thought it was best to include this reflexivity statement and try and explain to the readers how we have interrogated our positions as vegans, because obviously it is going to impact on the way that the data is analysed. So I think it's just best practice in qualitative research and any research to be really open about your own position and make it really clear to the readers how you have managed that bias.
Now, Devon, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I'm ready.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was probably the classics. So Animal Liberation by Peter Singer and Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows by Melanie Joy. And these were really revolutionary for me because I felt this anger and confusion and sadness about what we do to animals from a very young age. And growing up, never having had a vegan or a like-minded person in my life, I honestly thought that I was the only one who felt like this. So to have those feelings validated and to see those ideas expressed so eloquently was really empowering to me.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That really depends what you mean by scholarship. So I was recently flicking through my old school jotters that I found in my parents' garage, and I found an essay that I'd written in 2009 when I was 10 years old. Would you like me to read you a quote from it?
Oh, I'd love to.
So I said, I think eating meat is wrong because we're taking the life away from a living thing. One day, if we continue to eat more and more meat, there will be no animals left. And I also found a poem I'd written from 2009, trying to subvert the stereotypes and the bad reputation of sharks. I'm not sure if you want to hear a
Oh,
passage
please,
from that
yes.
one. Okay. So they tell me I should chase people and bite off their heads, but I'd rather make them cups of tea and tuck them in their cozy beds. They tell me I should destroy lives and hunt for people's blood, but I'd rather help them with their homework and play in the mud. They tell me I should swish my tail and flash my sharp bloody teeth, but I'd rather snuggle on the couch and make pretty Christmas wreaths. And I've drawn a lovely picture of a shark thinking about a cup of tea.
How wonderful. Well, that is charming. And we've talked a bit about children on Knowing Animals before, and about the way that children relate to animals and the way that so often they can see so much more clearly than adults can because they haven't unlearned what they already knew about animals. So that's a really wonderful thing to see. And it's nice to see you can connect to your previous self thinking about those things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those would definitely, I would consider those my first piece of pro-animal scholarship, but at a higher education level, I wrote both my undergraduate and my postgraduate thesis about animals.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So I'd have to go for my co-author of this paper, Carol Jasper, who also became my supervisor for my master's thesis, because even though she hasn't published much work in this field yet, she is the first academic that I'd heard talk about veganism in a positive way in my university. And that really flicked on a switch for me because, as I said before, I had been sort of battling professors to take me seriously when I wrote about animal rights. And then Carol gave a guest lecture on my master's course, and she was the first vegan academic that I had met. And it was really empowering to see that representation and know that if she was advocating for animals through academia, then I could do it too. And I remember when it came to picking our dissertation supervisors, we had to give our top 5 options. And I was a bit defiant and I just gave one. And I said, it has to be Carol. And luckily they accepted because I just knew that to fully succeed, I had to have a supervisor who understood my philosophy on a kind of fundamental level, and they weren't going to label me biased on the first whiff of talking about farmed animals as anything other than objects. And also, Carol introduced me to qualitative research methods, which was another light bulb moment for me because my background is in humanities, specifically in journalism and English literature. But I've always been really interested in science and psychology, and qualitative research methods have really helped me to bridge that gap. And I kind of see it as the intersection of storytelling and science, so it's beautiful.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Just don't stop thinking and writing about them, even when people are calling you polemic and biased, even when you have to un-vegan your paper a little bit through peer review. Just find a way around it and get your work out there and then defend it and be rational but compelling. I think that is what will have the biggest impact as our field grows, when it's legitimated. And people will have to start taking pro-animal scholarship seriously when we've got a really good evidence base that we can use to support policymaking and government consultations, even provide rational evidence-based rebuttal to pushback and propaganda in the media. All of these things will have a direct impact on animals or public opinion.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I mean, I want to see an end to animal agriculture, especially industrialized animal agriculture, because if people were forced to do these things to animals themselves, and to separate a baby cow from their mum if they want to drink milk, or drag the knife across a pig's throat and see the terror in their eyes, just eat a bacon sandwich. I actually don't think a lot of people would do it, but everyone would be comfortable blending some soybeans to make tofu or taking a courgette out of the ground.
What are you working on next?
Well, I might be co-authoring a paper on pescatarianism that's really interesting. I'm not sure how much I can say yet, but it's going to be a really illuminating piece of work. And also, I'm going to take the next year to do a little bit of traveling. I'd like to spend some time volunteering on animal sanctuaries and maybe contemplate a possible PhD topic for the future.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Probably connecting with me on LinkedIn is the best idea. I'm going to be sharing more on there. And also check out Earthling Ed and Surge Activism's work, because I'm involved in making some of that. And I think there's some really great high quality and shareable content on there about veganism and animal rights.
Well, thanks so much, Devon, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter, or X as it's now known, at knowing_animals, and we're on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter, or X, at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals and leave a review if you've enjoyed it. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.